The issue of visa-free travel within Africa for African citizens has long been a topic of discussion and frustration. Despite the African Union's vision to abolish visa requirement for all Africans by 2018, need I say, a deadline that was missed, progress has been slow and to date, only a handful of countries offer visa-free for African travelers. Others have crawled up to granting visas on arrival or uh, e-visas for African travelers. As Nigerian billionaire Aliko Dangote described it back in 2016, he needs 38 visas to travel within the continent on his Nigerian passport. Many European nationals waltz into most African countries visa-free. Fast forward to 2023, little to no change has taken place 10 years after the AU adopted Agenda 2063. A key part of that was to improve access to the continent for Africans, a feat that should have been achieved by 2018. But you know how the story unfolds. Sure, it is easy enough to travel within regional blocks such as the East African Community, the Economic Community of West African States, the Southern African Development Community, the Maghreb, as well as the Central African Economic and Monetary Community. However, many obstacles and challenges remain traveling intra-region. In fact, only last year, South Africa and Kenya resolved their long-standing dispute. The Rainbow Nation finally decided to offer Kenyans visa-free travel for 90 days. Kenya itself has only this year announced steps to ease travel for Africans. Logically, we ask, why? Why travel by Africans on African soil is such an arduous task? That's the focus of our meeting today. I am Kemini Amano, and you're welcome to the square. Joining our gathering are Maliba Arnold. He's public policy analyst. He's joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. We also have Kasango Dickens Pesa, who is Director General, Global Council for Promotion of International Trade. He's joining us from Kampala, Uganda. Also from Kampala is legal practitioner Kerabo Marian. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to the square.
Thank you.
I'm happy to be here.
Indeed. I want to start with you, Maliba. Where do you think Africa is in its quest to have open borders for citizens of the continent?
I think Africa has not made so much progress from I think that was on, it should be 14th or 15th of November 1884 Berlin Conference. We've not done so much to move away from what then became of that particular meeting, the outcome being what they call the General Act, because ever since then, the borders as drawn on pencil, like the one I'm holding in Berlin, during that particular phase, have really become much stronger, even though they were drawn by outsiders. There wasn't what I would call public participation. There was no participation by Africans in that particular process. And whereas the Berlin Conference really did one thing that we never talk about, that at that particular time, there was the general agreement that slavery by African states and the Islamic states and the Europeans should actually stop. That was one of the outcomes from that particular end. The borders as drawn then became literally what we have, the way we know Africa today. We are going about 170 years, if my mathematics is not so bad. And we've not moved away from that because today, even though our borders are slightly younger than the Berlin Conference agreements for a number of African countries, those boundaries and what we call sovereignty stands tall. It's much bigger than the essence of who we are as a people. So I think we've not made so much progress from that particular sitting where we didn't attend.
Right. Kasango, talk to us. You're in international trade. What are some of the challenges you experience in 2023 as a result of these closed borders?
Thank you very much for having me here. I think one, we need to look beyond our limited government structures and local or country level business, because in most cases, very many people are looking at business or their GDP from just a small segment. Yet Nairobi is playing a role, Kenya, South Africa, and we have been affected in such a way. I know there was a global trade review, one of the events we were partnering with, and we had over 600 delegates from across the world, people financing trade in Africa. And part of the problem we had is some of us who are coming in to develop real estate in Nairobi got their visas a week later on. And this is bad for business because in the process we're going to get frustrated, they're going to go to the next neighboring country, and we as the people that actually not in the typical government sector, we stayed on a day-to-day basis because the conversion on daily turnover plays into the general overall GDP. The other problem around is there's a lot of paperwork just to go to South Africa. I know it's the same for Nigerians and Kenyans and Rwandese. There's a lot of paperwork in the process. You cannot tell me with the digital structures you currently have available, you're going to literally have to utilize about 2 to 5 working days for someone to just evaluate paperwork to give someone a visa. So those have been some of the problems, and in the process, we are not where we ought to be because in the overall time, trust me, as you travel from one place to another, you're looking at time, you're looking at what is the monetary conversion. Yes.
Right. So the why is important because Madiba has talked about, the boundaries that were drawn by our colonial masters. You've also told us the challenges that are associated with these inaccessible borders to, citizens of the continent. Karibo, talk to us, Kirabo, I apologize, Kirabo, talk to us about why you think African countries appear to keep these colonial borders, restrict travel to other citizens of the continent. Why is that the case? Why is this so slow? Why are we slow in opening up the borders to one another?
So thank you for having me, first of all. So there are a lot of factors that do affect the African continent. I think was it Kasango who, I'm not sure, the previous speaker who spoke about the colonial borders. That is one of them. But these colonial borders, it doesn't. It's not only limited to what was drawn, but also the nature of the colonial politics at the time. You'll find that Africa was divided in two different, according to their colonial masters, and two different governance systems. We have the Anglophone, the Francophone, countries that were colonized by other colonial masters like Germany, Belgium. And so these particular colonial systems came with their own way of governance, and which the present states of Africa inherited. And that is where you see that the laws are different, the policies are different, the way they govern is different, the culture is also different. But that you will find that there might be Luo maybe in Uganda and Luo in Kenya. But because of, let me say, the systems, the colonial systems that governed, let me say, Kenya and Uganda, the culture becomes different, the way of governance, the politics becomes different. How they even gained their independence comes into play in what their present politics is. So you will find that when we sit down, first of all, we don't have a common language. Someone is speaking French, the other is speaking English.
Yeah, but Kirabo, we go to Europe and we go to places where Dutch is spoken. We go to places where languages that are not local to African people are spoken. And so why should language be a challenge for why we are not opening up our borders?
Well, but even when you look at these European countries, I'll say that, let me say, for example, a country like America, the common language is English. For most of Britain and its various, let me say, European colonies, English is the common language. France, French is the common language. Why is language so important? Because when it's difficult to trade, when you do not have a certain understanding, one of the ways you have a meeting of minds is if you're able to understand and communicate. So communication is very important when it comes to
Right,
business.
I get you, but that's the point I'm making, because even with the European Union, they all don't speak the same language. There could be similarities with their languages, but they do not speak the same language. And so I do not understand the link between languages and opening up the borders. Yes, it could pose some difficulties, but it shouldn't be a reason why I cannot come to Uganda visa-free.
You're talking about why it cannot come to Uganda visa-free. Okay, it could be one of the factors. So you have to look at context. There are other factors that come in way, but I was just giving an example that language is one of them. The other things that would connect to language would be the culture, and maybe other things that would come into play with things to do with security of borders and job security.
I see.
So the arguments that most countries have for protecting their borders would be the issue of, let me say, political instability. That if we allow you in our country, we don't know, and another aspect of terrorism has become a big issue. I mean, when we're talking about the Kenya-Somali problem, why we want to restrict our borders, because we are afraid that when some of your people come into our country, we do not know their motives. They might be terrorists.
Okay, now let's make some more progress. Let's move the conversation on to Maliba. Maliba, you mentioned earlier that while things are not as restrictive as in the 80s, when the continent was beginning to realize itself from colonial masters, there have been some easing of the borders. One of those signs that we have seen in the regional blocks, where, if you're within the West African regional bloc, you're able to travel within West Africa visa-free. If you're within East Africa, you can travel within East Africa visa-free. So if we have been able to achieve this regionally and block by block, what is stopping us from doing it for the entire continent? What do you think?
First of all, besides having what appears to be functional regional blocks, you will realize that within even those regional blocks, there is a lot of friction. I'll give you an example of East Africa, for example. Within EAC, whereas Uganda and Kenya have got what you would call almost cordial relations, and we have got very little that puts us, or rather pities us against each other, you realize that there is a little bit of a problem between Kenya and Tanzania, especially when it comes to trade. And I'll be speaking about that as an answer to your question. A little bit of that once in a while, you will see a standoff between Uganda and Rwanda. The Democratic Republic of Congo is now in EAC. Once in a while, you will see they are not seeing eye to eye with Rwanda and probably Uganda sometimes. So we've not walked away so much from that Berlin meeting. Even though we didn't attend, we have really swallowed the hook, sink, and line of what came out of that. But let me respond to your question because of trade. That is the need. Nationalism as sold to us in Africa means so many things. So today, out of what we call sovereignty, you will realize that a country closes its borders, not because there is any significant, or rather the significance that comes with closed borders, even away from security, you then just realize that we still are living around that nationalism as sold to us. Quickly, I need to point to this. When there is no trade, and the legal person who spoke ahead of me spoke about language, you would call it lingua franca, a functional language, or rather bridge language that brings us together for whatever reason, if it most likely trade and other reasons. Most of African countries do not produce anything. What we do in Africa is that we produce raw material and we therefore just export it. So there is very little appetite between African countries trading with each other. So because you will realize that probably the countries that are dominant in production in Africa have got much more coverage in how they reach out to the others. I would mention probably Egypt. I would mention South Africa. In the West, we have got Nigeria. In the East, probably Kenya. Still, it's not at the volume that will really allow them to open up to other countries. So then your question will be, and I will probably flip it and bring it back to you. Why would it be so easy for Burundi and Rwanda, for example, to trade with Paris, that's France, and so difficult with them trading with their neighbors, for example? It's simply because those countries, whatever they are putting out is so much of what I would call raw material. We don't do so much production amongst ourselves on the continent.
Right.
And we've been dominated, of course, by the West and now the Far East and China, bringing in everything here. Now, today you will realize that Mandarin, the language that is spoken widely in China, is now being taught across Africa. Yet, no one is teaching Yoruba in Nairobi. No one is teaching Kiswahili, which is spoken by almost a third of Africa today. No one is teaching it in Nigerian Lagos, for example. So one part as to why it's become, there's no appetite to deal with each other is that there's little. So we hold on to what we call sovereignty and defending those borders, and not because we really have got anything to defend other than we have nothing to say to each other. We have got little to trade, and trade is what will open up Africa. Leave alone the kinship and the geography. I have told you before on a set like this in the past that half of my family is in Uganda. Ordinarily, I should feel so easily Ugandan, but then because I was born in Nairobi, I have grown here, and my father is Kenyan, probably the other half of me doesn't really feel like I'm Ugandan. So the kinship part of it, the geography in itself has not been sufficient in opening up these borders. So besides the politics that played around colonialism, Africa is so much of a market.
Right.
We are a market. The West and the people from Asia really have turned us into a market, and we remain so. The only thing we do is that we send raw material and then we receive made, or rather already produced products.
Indeed.
That in and of itself reduces how we work and deal with each other.
Indeed.
Otherwise, if we worked on trade, the borders will open up so easily because somehow commerce has a way of opening up and
Indeed.
breaking down walls and even curtains, even if they're made of iron.
Absolutely. So I see a few things that you have mentioned here. Our ownership of languages, which is causing us not to own up to other Africans as well. So there is no belongingness when we look at the one, at the continental level. Kirabo has spoken about security. I want us to look at xenophobia. Whether or not all of this is pushing us into an area you could describe as xenophobic, in that as Africans, we can't see other Africans coming to our country and just leaving. We think that, particularly with wealthier nations, we think that they're coming there to take what belongs to us. What do you think, Asango?
Thank you. I think the previous speakers have actually done a very good job. And you see, at one point, from medium to high income earners and the business people, there's something we need to appreciate. In this whole global supply chain, there's something you're bringing on the table. If you don't upskill or offer it better than your neighbor, even next door, next step, you definitely can't compete. So to us now, we have to look at it from a place that, okay, yes, you're not going to stop the Chinese from coming in to invest into your country, the Japanese as well. Then we have people coming in and they're investing in carbon credits in Africa. What does that mean? Are we actually prepared as Africans? What are the systems from the education level? Because we are affected from family level first. We never thought about money. We never talked about investment. Our parents are just getting to understand in mid-30s, mid-40s. But you find yourself, the education system has actually taught you a particular way. You have to get a master's, you have to get a degree before you can actually get to appreciate investment cross-border beyond the vicinity you are born or beyond the city you are born in. So in that, the best approach around that is going to be, can we actually have better skills? Can we perfect certain things in the different sectors we are offering? If it's transportation, can we be the best? And this is the same approach I wrote to the African Union when they were in reviewing the new agenda. And we told them, at government level, you have very good policies, you have very good plans for the different African nations, but you never get down to follow through. You give them grants, they're going to show allocation of the grants, but you never come down. A typical youth, I know each one of the people on this panel is below 40 years for a fact. What does that mean to we as the continent citizens today? One, some have families. Number two, the employed. If they're not employed, they have a business. But at that level, what does it mean beyond the borders of Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania and Ghana? We are not realizing what is that particular state Kenya can have, Rwanda can have, Nigeria can have, and we each work together from a strength point of view to see that we aid the growth in the economy. Other than that, we're going to have foreigners coming and they'll take advantage because they have market. China today come to manufacturing, that's their strength. Come to the UK, banking, that's their strength. Come to the US, they have mastered security and information technology. So, given those examples, we need to look back. What can country A do better than country B? And use those strengths to build a united African continent. Thank you.
Indeed. I want to start, getting some solutions from you, Kirabo. We've looked at the problem. We've looked at some of the challenges that are bringing on the problem. Let's talk about solutions. How do we get around opening our borders to other Africans, not only for trade, but, for tourism purposes as well?
Well, of course, first I would say that we cannot redraw the borders. It's already there. So we can't rewrite our past. However, we can decide how our future looks like and we have to decide that in the present. So for me, the first thing is that we need, as an African continent, to have a meeting of minds and to bring ourselves to a fact to show that how relevant it is for us as an African country, how relevant is free trade to us as an African country, and not just, let me say, our political leaders realizing it, but it needs to come right to the grassroots of this ordinary Kenyan. Do they understand that can they hold their politicians accountable to make sure that we have flexible free trade policies that can enable me as a Kenyan to go to Uganda? Because some of these policies that come about, protectionism, nationalism, the xenophobia that you see in South Africa, is the fact that as an African country and as Africans, we see other Africans as the enemy. This person is coming to my country. I already have a few resources. I'm struggling to just keep afloat, and this person wants to take my resources. We need to find a way to root that. Comes with some sort of re-education, because even when we sit down and say, let us have better visa policies, let us make the visa process more less bureaucratic, or let us have a free visa policy. Mm-hmm. This may not be sustainable if a Kenyan feels, or a South African feels, that the more this, let me say, this person from Congo, the more this person from Ethiopia comes into my country, I will not have maybe job security, or this person is just coming to destabilize my country. It will not matter, because at the grassroots, people will be advocating against this better immigration policies that you want to put across, right, against this better visa policies. The pressure will be at the bottom, and it will force whatever policies then come up at the top. So I think as Africans, there needs to be a rediscovery of our Pan-Africanism, mm-hmm, as a continent. What advantage is there in the togetherness and African unity what are the benefits? And that needs to be not only at the level of our political leaders or at the people who sit at these AU conferences, but it has to come to the ordinary Kenyan, ordinary Ugandan, ordinary Nigerian, so that if I understand the importance of having free trade and the importance of having a unified African continent, it becomes easier for me to advocate and expect the same thing from my politicians who are going to go to these conferences and demand for the same thing. But if I, as a South African, feel that this is not relevant to me, that other Africans are enemies, I have to compete with them for resources, then it becomes hard even for the politician that has goodwill in South Africa, for the South African president to advocate for what? These free trade policies, or let me say this visa-free policies.
Indeed.
So there needs to be a discovery of
our
the
Pan-Africanism. Indeed.
Exactly.
Very important points you make over there, Kirabo. We'll talk more solutions and impact of open borders when we return. Don't go away. You're here on Village Square Africa. Today we are discussing open borders in Africa for Africans. My guests are Maliba Arnold from Kenya, Kirabo Marion from Kampala, Uganda, and Kasango Dickens Pesa, also from Kampala, Uganda. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience on the program. Maliba, let's get right into more solutions. What role can regional blocks play if we want to go the path of getting open borders to improve tourism, to improve trade on the African continent? What role can all these organizations and even the AU can play?
Actually, the regional blocs are in themselves baby steps towards Africa's integration. So that is at a smaller level because the AU and African integration is a dream that AU is pursuing. And you spoke about Agenda 2063. Of course, looking at aspiration 2, furthering Pan-Africanism, ensuring that the continent is more harmonized. I know Kirabo earlier on said that it's difficult to redraw the boundaries and the maps. That's not true. I know that is a radical option, but it's true. And I know a little bit of that makes us not have conversations that move forward, because once you talk about relooking at boundaries, you are opening up boundary conflicts and border conflicts. But in the long run, now talking about it in an aspirational way, is that what are we looking forward to? We are looking forward to an Africa that is one. Because the truth is that at the moment, the way we are, it doesn't serve us. It serves other people's interests and not us. And, you know, we've said this a lot of times, that the 19th century was about, was the European Renaissance. The 20th century was, of course, for the Asian Renaissance. And then the 21st century has been billed as that for Africa, that this, the 21st century will be the hour for Africa. But we are not going to actually realize that particular hour. The Renaissance will actually not see light of day if first and foremost we don't fix trade. Fixing trade, trade will look like it's much bigger, but then it's smaller things. Allowing people to cross to work, live, trade, and once you can allow in people, then we are going to have it easier about also allowing in capital, free capital, or free movement of capital between borders. At the moment, it's still a challenge. You will realize that money leaving one jurisdiction to another. Let me give you an example. If money were to come from DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Kenya, a little bit, you realize that the banking system as it is slows that up. If you have to get money from Kampala, for example, to Nairobi, there's the fear of money laundering, specifically for money that comes from DRC, probably cleaned up in Kampala, and then it's destined Nairobi to Nairobi, onwards to the rest of the world. So we need to fix that up. But you see how that is going to work? We need to, first of all, start re-socializing our thinking. There's nothing so special about Kenya, and there's nothing so special about being Ugandan that will make the Kenya-Uganda border and that nationalism so big an issue for us to do away with our interests. Today, there's need for work across borders. I will get a talented person in Kampala and have a problem to bring that person to work in Nairobi, or I will have somebody in Nairobi who could do so well for my business in Kampala. But because of this, what I would say is actually short-termism. Same thing with how xenophobia has been working. Xenophobia is simply a politician's short-term explanation to their failures at local level. And some of those failures could be addressed by opening up the borders so that we have got labor migration. That will actually help us to actually have shared prosperity, for example. You see, in South Africa, as much as they would complain about xenophobia, or rather influx of people, specifically from Zimbabwe and the neighboring countries, you realize that so long as South Africa prospers and Zimbabwe, Zambia, and the neighboring countries are struggling, there will always be an influx of the people looking for opportunities on the other side. But if we were to have a level way of development, then you do not have that problem. So opening up of borders is not a matter of choice. We actually have no alternative. Two, the future of work is going to render a lot of these borders useless, because if I can get a good person to work for me from Kampala who doesn't need to be here physically, I don't need even the visa. So the visa restrictions become useless in the long run. So whatever we are holding on the visa for then fails. So the future of work is going to force us to re-socialize our politics. Two, I think all of us speaking on this panel are, if my eyes are not so bad, even though I'm doing glasses, are millennials. That means we were born in 1980 onwards. What does that mean? It means that we are the most educated lot on this particular platform, or rather on this particular continent. We are a little bit more global. We see things differently than those who came ahead of us. So it's up to us to actually fix this continent for ourselves. The AU, I have spoken about the AU being a talk shop. Of course, we had some deadlines that they put on. We had 2018, for example, being the deadline that had been set for this, and we have not achieved it, and we've gone on and on. The same, of course, applies even to the regional blocks. In EAC, we are way, way, way behind. We had spoken about being a monetary union, having a single currency. The only thing we've done very well at the moment is to have the EAC passport, the regional passport. At least that in itself has widened, that the passport I hold today can get me to places much more than the Kenyan passport alone will actually have done. So we are making baby steps, but it needs to be intentional.
But these places are only within the East African bloc. And, as part of efforts to achieve that integration, we know that the African Union also introduced its passport, although at this point it's only circulating among specific people. But I do want to ask you again, Malabar, do you think that this passport introduction at the AU level has any potential at all to alleviate visa-related challenges?
I do not think that at the moment an AU passport is even helpful to the situation. It's not even a panacea to what we actually are talking about, because first of all, we have not even synchronized our civil registration regimes across blocks, for example. So you will have a problem when you're doing KYCs. If you're doing a business, for example, know your business, as in know your customer, the KYCs that businesses do, you will find that Uganda does not have a registration regime that probably is in sync or closer to how the Kenyans do their civil registration. So that, of course, brings it problems. Today, of course, we will talk about terrorism, security, and everything else. But a lot of these things can be taken care of, because you realize that a lot of problems we have cannot be solved in isolation. Like, for example, if we have got a problem of insecurity in Kenya, Uganda is actually going to either be passively involved, in a way being part and parcel of it. So at the AU level, I don't think that we are ready yet for the AU passport. If the East African passport cannot open the doors for me in West Africa, for example, if the East African passport cannot open up doors for me in the North, then I do not think that, as in, if Kenya, for example, and Tanzania and Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, South Sudan, have not yet even embraced each other's passports, how easy is it going to be for them to actually take on the AU, or rather the African Union's passport? It's going to be difficult. You realize that has not made so much traction. So we
Absolutely.
still have got some work to do. It's
Okay.
not difficult. It's about us being quite...
Right. I'll
Yes.
move on to Kasango now. Kasango, are there any success cases you could share with us regarding countries that have gone visa-free and is working perfectly for them, bringing them some economic benefit?
Yes, I think the biggest example is Kampala, Uganda, Kampala and Kenya, Uganda and Kenya, been very successful. My family is also in Kilimani, Kenya, and trust me, it's very, very good. Rwanda, Burundi, we're now moving towards also having now South Africa as well, and Kenya and Congo have also entered into an arrangement. So it's feasible. These countries have actually already signed and they're working towards it. Though, just in addition to one of the things I need to add, I think the president or the foreign affairs of these different countries need to find a way to have this information there. Why? Because if I register as a Ugandan to have a Ugandan passport, at all points, the foreign affairs and internal affairs of that particular country has all details regarding my national ID, my birth certificate, my passport number, serial numbers, and all that. So at country level, can they actually...
Well, it seems we lost the connection to
all this information cross-border with other foreign affairs. Can they share this information with other foreign affairs and internal affairs at East African community level, at ECOWAS, at African Union level? So the question now and the call for African Union would be, can they actually facilitate structures to have this information properly stored, secured, and ensuring that everything that is shared from foreign affair or internal affair level is actually tallying.
I see. Kasango, I'm afraid we cannot hear you and we're running out of time. I'm trying to sneak in a couple more questions before we do that. So I'll quickly move on to Kirabo. Kirabo, one of the things that we've talked about and Maliba alluded to is the issue of terrorism, security, money laundering and all that, which has become a reason that some of the borders remain very tight to some African countries. I mean, where do you think that leadership could strike the balance between national security and ensuring that trade and domestic tourism across the continent goes on well?
Well, I think first of all that African continents need to differentiate between good mobility and bad mobility. I don't think that criminality, terrorism, or the fear of all these bad things should be a reason why we should do away with the good side of what comes with free movement across the African continent. At the end of the day, when you weigh the pros and cons, you benefit more from having free trade. And even if you were to lock the borders and say that you are not going to allow people in because you fear terrorism, you fear other people coming into your country and creating a chaos, you'll find that in most African countries, the turmoil in most African countries comes from political governance.
Right.
Leaders staying long in power, military coups, or in some cases, it could also be foreign interference. Let me say what is happening right now in Mali and the French colonies together with France, and we know the foreign interference there. So it's not that most of these problems of insecurities come from outside, they're actually within. And most of them are just a governance problem. It's a leadership problem.
Leadership problem indeed. I'll quickly move on to Maliba. Maliba, I'll give you the last word on this one. We've talked about the solutions, we've talked about the problems, we've talked about what the impact could be if we don't change. My question to you, and I hope you can answer under 30 seconds, are we running out of time as a continent?
I actually was saying that we are running out of time because Africa is the youngest continent on earth, with 60% of Africans having been born in the last 60 years. So we definitely have got what we call a youth bulge. Africa will be experiencing a youth bulge by the year 2030. And there will therefore be more pressure on job, migration, and this is going just to exacerbate an already bad situation. So
right.
we need to actually work out open borders so that we create opportunities, make use of the resources we have, do production on our soil,
Indeed.
create jobs, and simply make Africa one.
I'm afraid
If
we have
don't
to go
do it
now. Thank
we
you
will
so
be forced
much
to do
for
it any other way. Already you see the migrations that are going on the other side.
Maliba, if you can hear me, I'm afraid we have to end our conversation, and we're so out of time. But thank you so much for your insight on the subject matter. Kirabu, Kasango, and Maliba, I appreciate your time. And for you at home or wherever you're watching us, let a conversation continue with your leadership to ensure that Africa does not run out of time in integrating mobility on the continent. I am Kemini Amano. I'll see you same time on Monday. Bye-bye.